out in the wilderness, the people were in a terrible state. They were battling every day, every hour with fear, exhaustion, privation, and pain. They knew extremes of thirst and hunger. Doubtless, illness was rife. For years, they did not know the direction of travel or where they would eventually settle, or even when. I think if you want to imagine the situation that the Israelites were in during their flight from Egypt, all you really need to do is turn on your televisions and watch the news reports and look at the faces of the Rohingya people who are fleeing Burma, and see in their situation, their faces, the endurance of a situation which would probably kill any one of us. Working several centuries after these events, gathering together memories and stories of that time and writing them down, the person or the people who have given us the book of Exodus in written form did a good job of conveying the fearfulness of the situation that their ancestors were in. The writer speaks of thunder and lightning, of trumpet blasts and smoke, and of people trembling with fear. And their fear makes them desperate to keep their distance from God. Tell us what God says to you, they implore Moses, but do not let God speak directly to us. Moses tries to reassure the people, to explain God's intentions, but still they hold back. And then the writer, perhaps unexpectedly, perhaps unintentionally, provides an image which in a very few words sums up the reality of the experience of God for many of us. God was in the thick darkness. As I'm sure I've said before, when I was in India a number of years ago, I visited the convent where Mother Teresa had lived, worked, and where she eventually died. I was very moved by an account that I read there of her lifelong experience of the silence of God. Having received as a young woman in Albania, where she came from, a sense of call to serve the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, she never again had a sense of God's immediate presence or guidance in her life, no matter how much she prayed for that. But for decades, she lived and worked in the hope that what she was doing was the right thing. What moved me was the realization that if even someone like her, so widely recognized for her holiness, experienced God not only as distant, but silent, even absent, somewhere unknown in the thick darkness, what right did I have to expect to be any different, to expect any vivid sense of divine presence or direction in my life, or to live with anything other than the hope that at least at times I may be doing the right thing? And I suppose I'm compelled to ask myself, if things were different, if I did have that sense of vivid presence, how would I cope? If I'm honest, I imagine I would be utterly terrified, as the Israelites were, as probably Moses was too. Somehow, though, Moses found the strength and the courage to approach the thick darkness, to enter it. And in doing so, he drew out strands of light. And these strands of light are what we see in the words of God he reported back to the people. For the Israelites, this was the beginning of the giving of the law, that great body of religious teaching which defines the Jewish people and religion, and upon which the Christian religion is also built. And we mustn't forget that. Jesus said that he had come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. So this is stuff that should matter to us too. This is teaching that we should not be ignoring. Today we've read one of the versions of the Ten Commandments which appear in the Bible. If you go back and read Exodus chapter 19, the chapter that comes before our reading this morning, you'll see that these verses are filled with drama and special effects, smoke and thunder, earthquakes and trumpet blasts. What chapter 19 is saying is that what is coming in chapter 20 is really important. So listen carefully. Be prepared to take it to heart, and don't forget it. It builds up a picture, an impression of a mighty God, an angry God even, and woe betide anyone who disobeys. But then we reach chapter 20, the verses which Ivy read for us. So now think about what the commandments actually say, what comes after all this thunder and smoke and lightning and all the rest of it. 4 of the commandments are about relating to God, and 6 of them are about relating to one another. Some of them, I grant you, are couched in pretty fearful language. But let's think about that for a moment. When the Bible uses the word fear, as in the fear of the Lord, it speaks about relating to God, and it carries several meanings. The lesser one, the lesser meaning of the word fear, is that sense of terror, such as the Israelites expressed to Moses. But the primary meaning of the word fear, when it's used in this context, carries the sense of respect. So when we are encouraged to fear God, it's more an encouragement to respect God than to be terrified by God. For how can we love a being of whom we are terrified? When you put it that way, when you emphasize the meaning of respect within the word, we see that respecting God is not so much to ask. It's something that we can do, and do gladly. Now let's think about the commandments given to regulate how we are to relate to one another. There's only 6 of them, but they cover very serious matters. However, if you turn them around, they seem much less like onerous prohibitions and more like welcome protections. For who wants to have a dysfunctional family? Who wants to be murdered or be the victim of adultery or theft or be lied against or have people coveting your family or your possessions? No one in their right mind, I'd venture. Out in the wilderness, the people were in a terrible state, but they had come from something even more terrible. They'd come from a place where they had no rights, where they had no dignity, no safety, where they could be murdered or stolen from or lied against with impunity because they were being treated as less than human. They were being oppressed by a system which worked them 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. So coming from that, the giving of the Sabbath was a liberation, not a restriction. An affirmation of the value of human life over the values of profit and wealth. These commandments, then, are about a new beginning, about starting afresh and living better, fuller lives. When we look back over the story that we have been following pretty much constantly since June, we see that it is full of new beginnings. Abraham and Sarah moving to a new place, starting a family, long after they thought that that was impossible. A pattern repeated, albeit with different details, down through the generations. At every turn, wherever there was adversity, there was also a new beginning. Leaving Egypt was a new beginning for the Israelites, and this, the beginning of the giving of the law, represents a new beginning in their relationship with God. I said last week that the story from Abraham to Exodus is an allegory for the whole of life. And here's another example of why that is so. Life, if we choose to see it that way, is a succession of new beginnings, of changes in direction. We face adversity, but opportunity so often awaits. It is when we look with the eyes of faith that we see, even when we are in the thick darkness ourselves, that God is in there with us, offering us strands of light and leading us through forgiveness and through renewal towards whatever's next, towards the new. Amen.